Chapter 2.2 The Birth of Civilization. Inequality is a word we hear a lot. If we look around at our world, it's obvious some people have more than they need, while others have barely enough to survive. But where did inequality come from? That's the question we're going to ask in this unit. Some of the ideas we'll cover are anthropology, the comparative study of human beings, the paleolithic era, that is human history before the adoption of agriculture, and the neolithic era, that is human history since the discovery of agriculture, but before the discovery of metalworking. The lithic suffix refers to the Greek word for stone, since humans use stone tools, so it's the discovery of agriculture that divides the old, paleo, Stone Age, from the new, neo, Stone Age. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, an Enlightenment thinker, thought it was the discovery of agriculture that brought inequality. His thinking went like this. The first people were hunter-gatherers who moved around and owned only what they could carry. However, once people started growing crops for food, they had to settle down. Thus, the birth of the first civilizations. In fact, the word civilization comes from the Latin word for city because it implies a settled way of life. According to Rousseau's way of thinking, all of the features that characterize a civilization inevitably followed. Agriculture led to a surplus of food, which freed up labor for other projects. A division of labor arose. Some people might farm, while others might make pottery or tools, and others protected the village. Naturally, some people would have more than others. The ones who protected the village, for instance, might demand more than their fair share, and who was going to argue with them? Belief systems that reinforced this power structure came into being. Worse, those who had acquired more could hand their wealth and status down to their children, land, precious metals, even other people they had enslaved. Thus, Rousseau wrote, the birth of civilization was tied to the birth of inequality. The problem is, we now know Rousseau's thinking was wrong. One of the fields in which Rousseau's ideas were very influential is anthropology, the study of human beings. For many years, anthropologists looked at hunter-gatherer peoples in areas that Europeans had colonized and settled and said, this is what our distant ancestors must have lived like. After all, these peoples did not own many material possessions, and their social hierarchy was rather flat. Again, we fall into the trap of the primitive, saying that peoples in other places of the world haven't changed since the dawn of time, and that one rule of progress holds true for different peoples and places. But modern hunter-gatherers aren't good stand-ins for our ancient ancestors. If we actually look at the evidence, things were quite different in the distant past. Let's go back 45,000 years ago, during the last glacial period, when sheets of ice covered much of the Earth. The parts not covered by ice, however, were fertile with broad steppes and valleys through which large herds of animals seasonally migrated. Of course, prehistoric peoples didn't leave us writings, but we can use other evidence to see what their lives were like. For instance, at Sungir, 200 kilometers east of Moscow, 3 elaborate graves, those of a man and 2 adolescent children, have been found, dating to about 32,000 years ago and what would have been the last ice age. They are buried with clothing, weapons, and jewelry. The beads adorning their bodies would have taken thousands of hours to manufacture. The remains of 2 other individuals were found without elaborate burial. Clearly, these pre-agricultural people must have had some sort of status hierarchy. The Sungir site is not the only evidence of a rich Paleolithic burial. Almost 24,000 years ago, in what is now the Mediterranean coast of Italy, a teenage boy suffered a mortal wound to his lower jaw. We can tell he was cared for by his people in the fact that the injury had begun to heal, but the boy died anyhow. He was buried with, among other things, a necklace made of mammoth ivory, a cap decorated with hundreds of shells and deer teeth, and a stone blade made with flint mined 200 kilometers away. Grave goods so rich that archaeologists called him the Prince. In France, the Lady of Saint-Germain-la-Rivière was buried 16,000 years ago with deer teeth that had come from 300 kilometers away in what is now Spain. Clearly, these so-called primitive people had some sort of complex hierarchy, as well as migration and trade routes. Then there's evidence of what we might call public works. The Mammoth House, for instance, was constructed 25,000 years ago in Kostensky on the Don River in Siberia. Measuring 12.5 meters, or 41 feet in diameter, it contains the bones of at least 60 mammoths. The site was most likely a seasonal hunting camp, but the large mammoth house has no remains of mammoth butchering within it, which suggests some sort of gathering place or religious purpose. The later Göbekli Tepe in what is now Turkey was a large temple complex created by people who lived in villages and harvested grain for part of the year and hunted migratory animals for the other part. Beginning around 11,000 years ago, after the end of the Ice Age but before the development of agriculture, they began constructing an elaborate temple complex which they decorated with megaliths, huge standing stones shaped somewhat like the ones later erected at Stonehenge. Only in this case the stones were carefully shaped and carved with images of predatory animals. The remains of butchered migratory animals such as gazelles were found around the site, suggesting that the temple was associated with the annual migration. These constructions must have required social organization and free time. All of this evidence suggests that Paleolithic people were far from egalitarian hunter-gatherers. Most likely they lived a cyclical lifestyle. Some of the time, they were dispersed into smaller bands. At times of plenty, they came together into a larger society and adopted new rules. We can see the equivalent in the potlatch culture of Native Americans from the northwestern Canadian coast, where people lived in informal clans for much of the year, but the salmon run brought them together into kingdoms ruled over by hereditary royalty and a culture of competitive gift-giving. In Inuit culture, conversely, coming together for the seal hunt was the time of collective living and great equality. In both of these cases, depending on the season, these societies and people's behavior were vastly different depending on the time of the year. Paleolithic people clearly were more diverse and dynamic than we often give them credit for. They must have had both some level of social inequality and remedies for inequality, both of which seem to be hardwired into human culture. Further, rather than civilization being a package of things and a process that only goes in one direction along the inevitable arrow of progress, culture is itself a tool with which people experiment and adapt to their circumstances. Activity number 2, depictions of the primitive. With your classmates, use the Jamboard or the discussion boards your professor has set up on your school's LMS to share media about both modern hunter-gatherers in these 3 categories: documentaries and educational materials, movies and popular culture, and visual depictions like Thomas Cole's The Course of Empire that I used in these videos. Explain what's going on in this media. How are these people depicted? What sort of narrative is being reinforced? Here are some tips for successful collaboration. Ask questions and be curious. Be careful where you put your comments on the app or LMS. Use your own personal knowledge and experience. Do research and share what you find. Draw a connection to other things we've seen in class for your classmates. And respond to your classmates.